All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think of the Mongol invasion, it's so easy to just picture this sudden, destructive raid that swept through and then vanished. But the reality is actually far more complex. The Mongol arrival wasn't just a brief catastrophe, it was the foundational blueprint for the modern Russian state. Today, we're going to explore how centuries of Mongol influence fundamentally altered the political, cultural, and geographic trajectory of Russia.
To map out this centuries-long saga, we're going to hit 5 key chapters: the Mongol Golden Age, shaping the Russian state; climate, plague, and chaos; the rise of Moscow; and finally, the final collapse.
Chapter 1. The Mongol Golden Age. First things first, we absolutely have to shatter this myth of the Mongols as just mere destructive nomads.
Because we are literally dealing with over 500 years of profound geopolitical integration here. We're talking from Batu Khan's conquests in the 1240s, right up to the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Empire in 1783. That's a massive span of time. This wasn't some brief occupation. It was this deeply complex, enduring relationship where the Rus principalities acted as total vassals, feeding the Khans with taxes, tribute, and soldiers.
And get this, they didn't just wander the steppes. They built massive urban centers. The nomadic camp of Sarai al-Jadid actually morphed into a permanent, sprawling capital stretching 7 kilometers down the river. At its peak in the mid-14th century, it housed roughly 75,000 people. That is a huge city for the time, and it was thriving on a vast agricultural production of wheat and millet. So how did they keep it all together? Well, the secret to their early stability was brutally enforcing what's called the Ulis system. They took the steppe populations, divided them up into units of exactly 1,000, and assigned them very specific grazing grounds, and moving between them, absolutely forbidden. This let the Khans perfectly track their manpower and resources, and it shut down any native rebellions before they even started. Because of this ironclad grip, overland trade just exploded. We're talking goods flowing all the way from China and Egypt right through the Horde cities. Moving on to Chapter 2, Shaping the Russian State. Now, what's really wild to think about here is how this exact Mongol administrative machine permanently rewired Russian society. Think about this for a second. Before the Mongols showed up, Kievan Rus was kind of a fragmented confederation. It actually leaned towards Europe and used these democratic town assemblies called the Veche. Free men would actually get together and debate huge issues like war and peace. But after the invasion, the script completely flips. Those democratic assemblies were heavily suppressed or just outright wiped out. Power got rapidly consolidated, setting up a highly centralized autocratic system that basically mirrored their conquerors. And here is a crazy piece of irony for you. The Mongol conquest actually catapulted the Orthodox Church to immense power. The Mongols gave the church total tax immunity. That meant any tax agent, Mongol or Russian, who tried to take church property faced the death penalty. No joke. So the church was able to rapidly gobble up land and become this massive beacon of national identity. And that spiritual security sparked a huge creative boom in the 14th century, giving us master painters like Rublev and Theophanes the Greek. So the big takeaway here is that Moscow literally copied and pasted the Mongol playbook. The Mongols ran their first census in 1257 to organize taxes in the draft, right? Well, the Russians absorbed that exact system, conscripting people by tens. They imported thousands of new words for trade, government, and the military. They even kept Mongol city names, like Penza and Kazan. Basically, Moscow used the Horde's very own methods to build a surprisingly tough central administration of its own. Chapter 3. Climate, Plague, and Chaos. Because just as the Golden Horde hit its absolute peak under Khan Özbeg, a perfect storm of environmental and biological nightmares started tearing it apart from the inside. It was a literal domino effect. It kicks off in the 1280s. A sharp drop in rain leads to desertification, totally wiping out vital grazing pastures. At the exact same time, the Caspian Sea starts rising and flooding the low-lying farms. So you have all these destitute nomads losing their herds and their homes, and they start crowding into major cities just to survive. And then comes the final fatal blow. The Black Death hits those massively overpopulated, undersupplied urban centers. The sheer scale of this tragedy is honestly hard to wrap your head around. One source reports 85,000 plague deaths in Crimea alone. 85,000. And this happened right around the time Khan Jani Beg allegedly hurled plague-infected bodies into the city of Kaffa in 1343, actively spreading the disease further. The Horde cities were just completely ravaged. to make things even worse, after Jani Beg died in 1357, the royal bloodline basically wiped itself out in infighting. The empire plunges into this era they call the Great Anarchy. We're talking over 25 men claiming the throne in a span of just 20 years. And if that political chaos wasn't enough, the great conqueror Tamerlane sweeps through in the 1390s, sacking the major cities and pretty much completely destroying the urban economy in those lucrative trade routes.
Chapter 4. The Rise of Moscow. So while the Khans are busy fighting each other in the ashes of plagues and invasions, a shift in power was quietly taking place. The Prince of Moscow was making his move up north.
See, the princes of Moscow actually got powerful in the first place by being the Khan's favorite tax collectors. But as the Horde weakened, they simply stopped paying tribute. Which leads us to the famous Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480, between Ivan III and Ahmad Khan. Now, history loves to paint this as some epic cinematic battle for independence, but the sources, they describe it more like a tense standoff. A glorified staring contest, really, where both armies just glared at each other across a river until eventually everyone just kind of packed up and walked away.
It's super fascinating, actually, because that standoff didn't snap Mongol influence overnight. Believe it or not, tribute still kept flowing to the Crimean Khans under different names for quite a while. Instead of instant independence, what this moment really proved was that Moscow had successfully absorbed the Horde's autocratic strength. Now Ivan III could flex that newfound muscle to dominate and absorb his own neighboring Russian principalities.
Chapter 5. The Final Collapse. As Moscow is rapidly consolidating all this power, the once mighty Golden Horde finally shatters, totally redrawing the map of Eastern Europe.
The whole empire just splintered into competing pieces. You had the Great Horde trying to hold on to the main lineage, but really struggling to survive. Then there was the Crimean Khanate, which incredibly actually teamed up with Moscow early on to take down their rivals in the Great Horde. A deadly political chess match for sure. And then you also had the Kazan, Astrakhan, and Nogai hordes, all carving out their own little domains along the major rivers.
But the tragic end for the Great Horde? It definitely didn't happen in a blaze of glory. Picture this. It's the winter of 1501. Sheikh Ahmad, the very last Khan of the Great Horde, takes a huge gamble marching west to find pasture for his starving herds, but he gets trapped in this vicious snowstorm. His army is starving, demoralized, and they just desert him en masse. Even his own wife abandoned him to defect to the rival Crimeans. He was captured the next year with barely a fighting force left and spent his final years as a political prisoner. Just a brutal end.
And this sparked a massive reversal of fortunes. Over the next century, a highly aggressive, crusade-minded Moscow started systematically swallowing up these weakened khanates. Ivan IV took Kazan in 1552, then Astrakhan in 1554. Now, the Crimean Khanate did put up a fight. They even burned Moscow to the ground in 1571, which is wild to think about, but they too were eventually overpowered. The whole saga finally wrapped up in 1783 when the Russian Empire officially annexed Crimea, snuffing out the very last vestige of the Mongol Empire.
So I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. Our sources note that crushing those old democratic assemblies essentially stopped conventional democracy from expanding in Russia. If that invasion had never happened, would Russia's political and social trajectory have mirrored the European Renaissance? The Mongols obviously lost Russia in the end, but did their unseen architecture permanently lay the authoritarian foundation of the Russian state we know today? It's an incredible piece of history, and it really shows just how deeply the past shapes the present. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.